Hey everyone! Not long ago, I did a video where I talked about books I read recently, and one of those books was this collection of short stories. They came from outer space, 12 classic science fiction tales that became major motion pictures, edited by B-movie writer, producer, director Jim Wynorski. I kept my comments there pretty brief, saying what I thought of the collection overall and how much I enjoyed reading it. But I thought some of you might be interested in hearing a little more, so today I'm going to share a few thoughts on each individual story and the films, if I've seen them. I would still like to keep it brief, but there are 12 stories to cover, so it's quite a bit. I'm not going to discuss specific details or endings. With short stories, especially science fiction stories or horror stories, the final twist is sometimes the best part, and I don't want to ruin anyone's enjoyment of the surprise should somebody hear me talk about a certain story and decide, hey, I think I'll read that for myself. Although I will talk about the films, and if you've seen the film, then you may have an idea of what happens in the story, but that's not a guarantee, because a lot of these movies did not follow their source material closely, but we'll get into that. There are 12 short stories printed here in order of original publication. Since the common thread of the collection is that these stories were adapted into major motion pictures, there's a short preface before each one where Jim Wynorski talks about the story and the film and how they compare with each other. Of course, his comments are very subjective. I didn't always agree with what he had to say, but he did have some interesting background information. To be honest, I soon learned to skip these prefaces, since he's not quite as considerate when it comes to not giving away the whole thing. There's also a blurb about the film, cast, crew, plot synopsis, included after each story. Additionally, there are several sections in the book that feature black and white film stills and promotional material, and there are a few behind-the-scenes images, so this is really neat. Occasionally, some of these images are humorous to see because once you've read the story, you realize just how far the film went in its own direction. So those were fun to look at. As I said in the other video, I thought a few of these stories were great, some of them were very good, the rest were decent, and there was only one story that I didn't like at all. And I'm sure when we get there, that will be an unpopular opinion with some people, but oh well, these are my thoughts on the 12 stories included in this book. Story number 1 is Dr. Cyclops by Henry Kuttner, about a German doctor who's been experimenting with shrinking live organisms. I'd put this story in the decent category. It has a Frankenstein, Island of Dr. Moreau element to it, though it's not quite as provocative or as disturbing as those older works. I've mentioned before that H.G. Wells's Island of Dr. Moreau gave me nightmares, which continue to haunt me from time to time. Dr. Cyclops was published in 1940, and the pre-war setting gives it an extra element of interest, as does the survival adventure angle. It didn't strike me as especially intriguing or original. There was a certain point where I felt confident that I knew what was going to happen, and I wasn't wrong. And it has little more than the bare bones of character development, but it was diverting for the time it took to read it. In 1940, it was made into the Technicolor film Dr. Cyclops, which I have not seen, directed by King Kong's Ernest B. Shadesack and starring Albert Dekker as the Doctor. Story number 2 is Who Goes There by John W. Campbell Jr., in which researchers in Antarctica find themselves battling an extraterrestrial being with horrifying abilities. This story was the basis for 1951's The Thing from Another World and 1982's The Thing, but this collection was published in 1980 before the second version came out, so it doesn't mention that at all. It does mention in Ray Bradbury wrote the introduction to this book, and he does express a desire for a new, more faithful adaptation of The Thing. He didn't know it was just around the corner. I read this story back in 2014, and I thought it was okay. In the last few years, I've been asked a few times if I've read it and what I thought of it, and I said, I found it a little too scientific and technical and kind of dry. I have a feeling that answer put some people off. I was not planning to reread it. I jumped around in the book, choosing stories based on what I could read in the amount of time that I had, because I wanted to read each story in one sitting if possible, or I would read whatever caught my fancy, and I intended to skip the stories I had previously read. However, after I'd gone through the rest of the book and enjoyed it so much, I changed my mind. And boy, am I glad I did. I had a completely different reaction this time. For one thing, the first time I read it on the computer, which was awful, terrible idea. For another thing, either I'm smarter now than I was then, or the scientific arguments and the expounding on what could be versus what is really aren't that hard to follow. It caught and held my attention from the first line on, and I was eager to keep reading straight to the end. I only stopped twice because I had to. At 60 pages, this is the longest story in the collection, and I just couldn't get it done in one sitting. I do think that there are a couple disjointed sections, key turning points where it's hard to make out what exactly is going on. Something startling would happen, and then characters would reconvene to discuss it, and I felt like I had missed something, so then I'd go back and reread the section and feel like I hadn't really missed anything. It was just described in a vague way because a whole bunch of things are happening all at once, and it's not even clear to the people who are witnessing it what they're seeing. I've mentioned more than a few times here that I vastly prefer the 1951 Howard Hawks film, directed by Hawks and Christian Nyby, starring Kenneth Tobey with James Arness as the Thing, over the 1982 film, directed by John Carpenter and starring Kurt Russell. That is a matter of personal opinion, and in case there's anyone out there who needs reminding, everybody's free to have their own opinion. Personal preference aside, I grant that as an adaptation, the later version sticks closer to the original story, to a certain extent, while the older film covers less than half of the material and makes a lot of changes and additions. But knowing how much The Thing from Another World leaves out or changes doesn't make me enjoy the film any less, and I don't like The Thing anymore just because it's more faithful. I still find it an incredibly grotesque, off-putting movie. I can't look at certain images from that movie without feeling totally grossed out. John W. Campbell Jr. hints at grotesque things, and you could classify this as a horror story just as much as a science fiction story. But he doesn't go overboard with his descriptions. A lot of it's left to the reader's imagination. And I have a pretty good imagination, so that's okay. The atmosphere and mood are intense, and the pacing quick in spite of some exposition blocks, and the rising sense of dread and paranoia as these men start suspecting each other and turning on each other and wondering about themselves is its best aspect. It's great stuff, and I'm glad I read it again so I could reevaluate it. And now the next time that somebody asks me, hey, have you read Who Goes There? I can say, yes, I've read it and I really like it. Story number 3 is Farewell to the Master by Harry Bates. Following the death of Klaatu the spaceman, a curious photojournalist sets out to uncover what his robot companion might be up to after hours. I had also read this story before, a couple years ago, and again, I had an indifferent reaction. But when I changed my mind about Who Goes There after reading it again, I had to see if lightning would strike twice. And it did. Farewell to the Master was adapted in 1951 as The Day the Earth Stood Still, directed by Robert Wise and starring Michael Rennie. I'm so partial to and familiar with that film that I really couldn't get it out of my head the first time I read the story. Plus, there were a lot of things going on in the background that were distracting me, and noisy distractions do not make for a good reading environment. There weren't any distractions this time, so my mind didn't wander in the description-heavy passages, and I was able to appreciate the story for what it was. Really, the story and the film are two different animals. They share some principal elements, but the execution is completely different. The story's mysterious in that you don't know what's going on, and you don't know if you should be scared or not. The 3 central characters are compelling and expressive beyond what you would think possible, and it has a great parting twist that the film didn't include. I don't care that the film doesn't stick to the story because I enjoy it the way it is. In fact, I think I like the film being so different because that allows for 2 separate experiences. In a way, you get 2 for the price of 1. 3 if you want to include the later remake, but I just pretend that movie doesn't exist. Once your brain lets go of the comparison fixation, you're free to imagine your own visuals based on the language that Bates uses. And how I imagined this story playing out in my head is almost nothing like how the film looks, and that's perfectly fine. Story number 4 is The Foghorn by Ray Bradbury, which was adapted in 1953 as The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, directed by Eugene Lauret and starring Paul Hubschmid. As I mentioned, Bradbury penned the introduction to this collection, and in that intro he talks about how he was called in by a producer to revise a movie script and discovered that that script was based accidentally on his own story. He's also very frank with his criticism of the film in its final form, which he thought was terrible. The film is regarded by many to be the inspiration for Godzilla. I can't say much about it one way or another because while I have seen The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, it was years ago and I don't remember much about it beyond Ray Harryhausen's special effects. I will say this, though, and don't let this be a reflection on the story itself, this is just a side comment. While I tend to love Bradbury's writing style, I don't always love what he has to say, and that was the case with this intro. He speaks quite disparagingly of some of the films these stories inspired. Films which are now considered classics, films that I love, that classic horror fans love, that really put me off. I understand the writer's bitter point of view. I understand where he's coming from, and how he sympathizes with every other writer who sees their work turn into something completely different, and then that film is much more well known by the general public than the story. I get it, but I was put off by how pompous and belittling he sounds, so I wish I'd skipped the intro. But the story is good. Not one of my favorites in the collection, and not one of my favorite Bradbury stories either, but it's thought-provoking and well-written and subversive in the way it tells of a giant monster in such a philosophical and almost intimate way. It also contains a lot of emotion in just a few pages. It's the shortest story in the collection, I think, and it manages to convey much more as far as feeling and depth goes with much less. Nope. Had to carve up a rotisserie chicken. Hang on a second. Story number 5 is Deadly City by Ivar Jorgensen, in which a few individuals wake up to find themselves alone in a silent, empty city. This one was okay. There's an eeriness about it, about the abruptly abandoned location, which is accentuated by the sudden outbreak of strange, unearthly cries, which gave me goosebumps. I was reading it in the middle of the night in bed, and it was kind of spooky. But it's less man versus other, more man versus man, as these individuals find each other, and human nature being what it is, conflict erupts. It's got a couple concepts that we've all seen used in post-apocalyptic entertainment of the last 20 years especially, and I could list several things it reminded me of. The Day of the Triffids, for one, which was published 2 years earlier. Also the film The World, the Flesh, and the Devil, which came out 6 years later, and 1946's Key Largo. I was reminded of that while I was reading it as well. I did find the writer's attempt to throw in some sexual tension messy. It was clumsily handled and uninteresting, so it just got in the way. He also takes a page from The War of the Worlds and does something I thought was kind of lame. It was definitely a story that I felt was better in the first half than in the second half. In 1954, Deadly City was adapted as Target Earth, directed by Sherman A. Rose and starring Richard Denning. I thought I'd seen it, but it turns out I haven't. I was getting it confused with 1955's Day the World Ended, which was directed by Roger Corman and also stars Richard Denning. Since it was some of the execution I found wanting and not so much the premise, I have a feeling I might like the film better, so I'm going to check it out sometime. Story number 6 is The Alien Machine by Raymond F. Jones, in which a shipment of parts is delivered to an aircraft plant different from what was ordered and far superior to anything the engineers have seen before. The story is about the characters trying to figure out the source of the shipment and how to put the mysterious puzzle pieces together without knowing what exactly each part does. This was one of the last stories I read, and I really liked it. It's probably not the type story that holds up to multiple readings, if you remember how it turns out, but for one go-around, I found it fun and creative. The Alien Machine was adapted as the first act of 1955's This Island Earth, directed by Jack Arnold and Joseph M. Newman and starring Jeff Morrow. The film is actually based on Jones's novella, which combines 3 previously published stories, including The Alien Machine, into one narrative. I did see this film several years ago, but aside from some imagery and elements from the beginning, I don't remember much about it, so I really can't comment on it. Story number 7 is The Cosmic Frame by Paul W. Fairman, which follows a bizarre string of events that occur after a teenage boy hits an alien with his car. This was one of my favorites. It's fun and kinda scary, with a great twist that made my jaw drop in surprise and then in delight. I went into it with low expectations, knowing that it's the story that 1957's Invasion of the Saucermen, directed by Edward L. Kahn, was based on. That's not a great movie, and because the low budget could only render goofy-looking cabbage head aliens, they ended up playing the whole thing for laughs. I did see the movie just a couple years ago, but I somehow forgot the entire plot I don't remember if it has the same twist as the story, but because I had forgotten everything except how goofy the aliens look, it was a whole new thing to me. The film has clunky B-movie charm, but for my part, I enjoyed the story a lot more. I probably shouldn't rank it higher than some of the more famous and renowned short stories in this collection, but in terms of sheer enjoyment, it's up there. Story number 8 is The Fly by George Langland, in which a scientist's work on matter transmission leads to an experiment gone horribly wrong. This is the only story I did not read in this collection, simply because I had just read it a few months earlier as part of another short story collection, so my thoughts on it, unfortunately, aren't quite as fresh. It's also got another disadvantage. This is the only case where I have done an in-depth discussion of the movie adaptation, 1958's The Fly, directed by Kurt Newman and starring David Hedison, which I reviewed very favorably in October of 2020. The movie's a pretty faithful adaptation overall, more faithful than most of these films, but there are a couple things that the original story, not having to deal with the limitations of censorship, was able to get into that make it a bit heavier. The story is darker, and as far as horror of the grotesque goes, I think the detail about the pet cat's particles getting mixed in with the fly's particles really give it an edge in that department. However, in this instance, I do prefer the adaptation, which is a very fine, compelling film. Story number 9 is The Seventh Victim by Robert Sheckley, in which an emotional catharsis bureau allows people to sign up to commit authorized murder in an effort to maintain world peace by getting man's aggression out of his system. How's that for a premise? This was a very good story. I enjoyed it. It's short and punchy with just enough exposition to explain the setting. Because the scenario is so crazy and yet handled so matter-of-factly, I felt there was no telling how things were going to go, and that made it an entertaining and engrossing ride. The Seventh Victim was adapted as The Tenth Victim in 1965, directed by Elio Petri and starring Marcello Mastroianni and Ursula Andress. Based on what I've read and seen, the film makes a lot of changes and is very stylized, very of its time. I haven't seen it, and I don't anticipate that I'm going to. It doesn't appeal to me at all. Story number 10 is The Sentinel by Arthur C. Clarke, in which a member of a team of researchers on the moon spots a hitherto unnoticed structure in the distance. I think this might be the story I was originally looking for when I found this collection through the library. It was first written back in 1948, 20 years before it would be adapted for the screen, along with a couple other stories that came together in Clarke's script in 2001: A Space Odyssey, directed by Stanley Kubrick. I'd really rather not talk about 2001: A Space Odyssey because there are some people who get a bee in their bonnet if you do less than praise it. Here's the deal. There are some things that I like about it, and there are some things that I don't like. Let's just leave it at that. After reading about how it came to be, with the development of Clarke's book and Kubrick's film in tandem, and how afterward Kubrick obstinately refused to explain anything that the public had questions about, while Clarke did provide an explanation in his book, I began to suspect that I might enjoy the book more. This story is not in the book, I don't think, although maybe it's included somehow, but it is a stepping stone in that direction, and I liked it. I liked the clarity of its prose, and I liked the ending. It doesn't really have a twist, but it ends on this hesitant note that you can interpret one way or another, optimistically or pessimistically, and I liked it. Story number 11 is The Racer by Ib Melchior, revolving around a race in which you get more points the faster you reach your destination and the more people you maim or kill along the way. This story was adapted in 1975 into the cult Roger Corman film Death Race 2000, directed by Paul Bartel and starring David Carradine. I haven't seen the film, but I was familiar with the general premise, which is a disturbing one, although I think it crept its way into our pop culture. The story's plot goes about the way I expected, which is why it's good that it focuses less on plot and more on establishing the background of moral decay and how a life-changing instant of conflict can lead one to confront reality. I'd rate this one of the very good stories. And story number 12 is A Boy and His Dog by Harlan Ellison, set in a post-apocalyptic wasteland where dogs are telepathic, well-read, and able to talk with their owners, helping them track down girls to rape. This is the story in the collection that I didn't like, and that's actually an understatement. I loathed it. Harlan Ellison is a big deal in the sci-fi world. He was also a guy who loved to be controversial, and he certainly did everything he could to offend in this Nebula Award winner of 1969. The writing's creative, the initial concept is interesting, the conversations with the dog, who is the most likable character, are humorous, and the storytelling is succinct. But the content was so repellent. I was disgusted. I hated it. I also felt it didn't fit in with the other stories in this collection. There's only one other entry, Deadly City, that has adult themes, suggested content, and it's not pornographic the way this one is, and it's clumsily handled, but it's not really offensive, and I cannot emphasize enough how much I did not like this story. It was adapted into a film with the same title in 1975, directed by L.Q. Jones and starring Don Johnson, and I have not seen the film. Okay, those are my thoughts on these 12 stories. I hope that you enjoyed the discussion. On the whole, I really liked the collection, and I enjoyed getting into the groove of reading 1 or 2 science fiction stories a day. It's fun to have a little getaway for a half hour or so, and embark on an adventure, or a mystery, or a horrific thrill ride in the future, or a distant place, or some remote area where humans do not typically set foot. I was similarly enthusiastic about the last sci-fi short story collection I read, Tomorrow's Children, edited by Isaac Asimov. That was a few years ago. I probably won't wait so long before picking out a new one because I really enjoy the experience. And I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.